Within just a few hours, one of America's closest allies was crossed off the board of a new global power game. Not because of war, not because of betrayal, but because they refused to pay and refused to stay silent. At the same time, hundreds of NATO soldiers who once fell in Afghanistan were told they had been on the sidelines. A single remark powerful enough to shake the war-torn memories of an entire continent and raise serious questions about the future of the world's strongest military alliance. This wasn't just a diplomatic spat. It was a signal, a sign of a new security order taking shape, one where security is a commodity and allies are measured by their invoices. If you want to understand why Canada was pushed to the sidelines, why Greenland is now a focal point, and why NATO is facing its deepest crisis of trust in decades, stay with us until the end of the video. And if you're looking for geopolitical analysis that's sharp, honest, and unafraid to confront the truth, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the stories that are shaping our world. There were no gunshots in Davos, no military convoys, no sirens, no war maps spread across a table. But sometimes history doesn't turn with cannon fire. It turns with a letter, brief, public, and so cold it made readers realize something had just been severed, not on the battlefield, but in the way allies see one another. Canada, a country that stood shoulder to shoulder with the US through nearly every major war of the modern era, suddenly found itself excluded from a new security initiative launched by Washington. No private consultation, no back-channel talks, just an announcement, as if Ottawa were a distant observer, not a partner who had shared blood and burden for decades. That sense of being sidelined didn't come from a single decision. It had been building through small but clear signals, through dismissive remarks about NATO's relevance, through a retelling of the Afghanistan war that seemed edited, where Allied soldiers were suddenly portrayed as having been in the background, even though they had fallen in some of the harshest terrains. And then through a new attitude where protection was no longer a shared duty, but increasingly resembled a conditional service. In that moment, Ottawa realized this wasn't a typical diplomatic disagreement. It was a shift in how America defines its alliances. Gone was the assumption that historic bonds guaranteed a seat at the table. Gone was the belief that past sacrifices earned present influence. In their place, a new logic, rougher, colder. Those who contribute the way the US wants get a voice. The wound wasn't just about being left out of an initiative. It was the message underneath that even the oldest alliances can be renegotiated without explanation. And for a country like Canada, whose entire strategic identity is built on being a trusted partner, that shock cut deep. That's why Canada didn't respond with outrage, but with calculated silence. The silence of a nation coming to terms with the fact that the familiar security umbrella was still there, but no longer free. That behind the soothing talk of natural protection, a new order was taking shape, one where security was measured by compliance and the willingness to pay the price. And as that picture became clearer, people began to look again at the name just announced with glowing language, a peace council, a mechanism marketed as a solution for global conflict and rebuilding. But the questions now weren't just about who gets to join, but how, under what terms, and what the real cost would be. Because from the moment Canada was crossed off the list, it became clear. This wasn't just about peace. It was about how power is being bought and sold in a world changing faster than ever before. The Board of Peace was announced in the familiar language of the 21st century. Grand vision, global responsibility, and promises of a more stable post-war order. On the surface, it looked like an effort to patch up a fractured world, a council powerful enough to oversee reconstruction, coordinate peace, and prevent power vacuums from turning into new conflicts. But peel back that layer of words and you quickly see, this isn't a continuation of international law. It's a new kind of test. Can peace be structured like a marketplace? The Council's framework isn't built on representation or shared obligation. It's built on fees. $1 billion for a permanent seat, not to build new capabilities, but simply to have a presence where decisions are made. This isn't a reform of the United Nations. It's a parallel model where participation isn't earned through history or collective duty, but through ability to pay and alignment with Washington's vision. Within that logic, Canada became an awkward case. Ottawa declared its support for peace, for reconstruction, and expressed willingness to contribute in its own way. But it refused to pay $1 billion for a seat, not out of financial constraint, but out of principle. Because accepting that model would mean accepting that global security can be openly commercialized, and that a nation's role is no longer measured by its commitment, but by its invoice. At that delicate moment, Canada's Prime Minister took the stage in Davos and spoke about the weakening of the rules-based order. He spoke of great powers using economics and security as leverage. He brought up Greenland, the Arctic, and self-determination, topics that seemed distant but struck directly at the strategic space Washington is now trying to reshape. It wasn't an anti-American speech, but it was a reminder there are lines allies cannot silently cross. The response came quickly and directly. On the same stage, the President of the United States declared that Canada survives thanks to America, that the new defense system would naturally protect them, and therefore gratitude should be made more visible. In that phrasing, protection was no longer a mutual commitment, but a favor granted from above. And just hours later, the invitation to join the Board of Peace vanished, as quietly as it had appeared. No private call, no diplomatic back channel, just a message clear enough for every other capital to understand. This is not a council of equals. It is a chessboard, where seats are assigned based on obedience and willingness to pay. Peace, in this model, isn't a shared goal. It's a product, managed by those holding the keys. And this is where the lines between past and present begin to blur. Because when security comes with a price tag, when participation must be purchased, one question becomes impossible to ignore. Do past sacrifices still mean anything? The war graves, the years of deployments, the commitments signed in the name of alliance, are they still the foundation or just inconvenient memories? That question sharpens when the memory of Afghanistan is brought back, not to be honored, but to be reinterpreted. When the American president says allies stood off the front lines, he's not just denying a military fact. He is, whether unintentionally or deliberately, severing the link between sacrifice in the past and political standing in the present. And from that moment on, the Board of Peace is no longer just a story about a new council. It becomes the backdrop for a deeper, more painful debate. Is Article 5 being rewritten? Is the memory of Afghanistan being erased? Is the very idea of alliance being reshaped in a way that renders spilled blood meaningless? Some words take only seconds to say, but decades to fully grasp the damage they cause. When the US president declared that NATO troops in Afghanistan had been on the sidelines, it wasn't just a false statement. It was a cold blade, slicing through the collective memory of an entire generation of allies, people who had believed they were fighting the same war, bound by the same promise. Afghanistan wasn't some distant campaign for Europe or Canada. It wasn't an optional adventure. It was the direct result of Article 5, the first and only time in NATO's history it was invoked in the wake of 9/11. There was no pressure, no ultimatum. European governments could have chosen to stay out, but they didn't. They sent their sons and daughters to a land where they had no direct strategic interests for one reason alone. America had been attacked, and the alliance had to mean something. Cold statistics never tell the full story, but they remain as undeniable milestones. Over 150 Canadian soldiers died in Kandahar. Hundreds of British troops fell in Helmand. The French, the Danes, the Poles, each nation brought home flag-draped coffins. They weren't in the back. They were in the deadliest zones, on patrols, in ambushes, in the long days where the line between life and death was paper thin. So when that history is retold as a footnote, the response cannot be mere diplomatic coolness. It strikes at families still keeping photos of lost loved ones in their living rooms. It strikes at veterans carrying both physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives. And it strikes at something deeper, the belief that their sacrifice mattered within the structure of shared security. The danger isn't just the insult, it's the logic behind it. If those sacrifices can be dismissed simply because they are no longer politically convenient, then what's left of Article 5 besides ink on paper? An alliance only endures when its shared memory is respected. When that memory is erased, the alliance begins to rot from within. Europe and Canada's reaction wasn't a clinging to the past, it was a reflex of self-preservation. Because if Afghanistan, the battlefield most directly tied to Article 5, can be rewritten, then what guarantee is there that current commitments won't shift when the winds change? Trust and security doesn't collapse with a single shock. It erodes bit by bit through words that seem harmless at first. And in that context, a strange paradox emerges. At the same moment Afghanistan's memory is being downplayed, Washington is speaking louder than ever about existential threats, intercontinental missiles, outer space, nuclear war. The past is being diminished, even as the future is painted in apocalyptic tones, demanding massive investments and deeper strategic dependence. At that crossroads, the story takes on a new form. From the graves in Kandahar, the Allies' gaze is drawn upward, to the North American sky, where a new concept is being sold as the promise of absolute protection. Golden Dome, an unprecedented defense shield, vast enough to cover an entire continent, and expensive enough that only a select few can have a say. The contrast is impossible to ignore. When the memory of sacrifice on the ground is blurred, while defense projects in the skies are elevated to top priority, people are forced to ask, is this still collective security, or a new architecture of power, where protection is distributed from the center under conditions set by one hand? Afghanistan, in this narrative, is not just the past. It is the measure of trust. And when that measure is bent, every promise about the future, no matter how wrapped in cutting-edge technology, begins to cast a shadow. From the dusty trenches of Central Asia, the Western security order is drifting skyward, where the Golden Dome is presented as the final shield. But the question still hangs in the air. Who does that shield really protect, and at what cost? Golden Dome was introduced in the familiar language of absolute security, a shield wide enough to cover all of North America, a system sophisticated enough to intercept every threat, from intercontinental missiles to space-borne attack platforms. In a world growing more unstable by the day, the idea sounds like one final promise of reassurance. No matter what happens, there will still be a layer of protection above our heads. But the deeper you go into the structure of Golden Dome, the clearer it becomes. This isn't just a defense project. It's a new architecture of power built on technology, vast budgets, and most crucially, centralized, absolute control. The numbers alone are staggering, hundreds of billions of dollars over decades. A multi-layered system stretching from the ground to the atmosphere to low Earth orbit. Satellites, radars, artificial intelligence, real-time command centers stitched together into a single grid. But beneath all the technical diagrams lies a very old question. Who decides when the shield activates, and for whom? Golden Dome isn't being proposed as an allied initiative. It's not under NATO's framework, nor is it a multilateral agreement like traditional NORAD. It's described as an American system built by the US, operated by the US, and from which other nations benefit as a matter of course. That language may sound benign, but in strategic security, the difference between building together and benefiting from is a deep, consequential divide. When protection becomes a favor, the right to be protected is no longer guaranteed. It becomes something that can be used as leverage to pressure, to negotiate, or to remind others who holds the switch. For allies, this introduces a new kind of unease, not fear of an external enemy, but uncertainty about where they stand within the defense system itself. For Canada, that feeling is especially acute. Geographically, Canada is no peripheral actor. Every missile trajectory over the Arctic, every scenario for nuclear conflict between superpowers passes through or over its space. For decades, Canada hasn't just been protected, it has been an integral part of North America's early warning structure. NORAD exists because of that reality, but Golden Dome is being mapped out as if that history were simply background, a job completed. The new system doesn't require broad consensus. It requires acceptance. And that acceptance, in a moment when alliance is being redefined, carries a cold message. Protection is no longer a mutual duty. It's a service, provided by one and received by others. From there, Golden Dome moves beyond the military domain. It becomes a geopolitical lever. Who gets deeply integrated? Who stands at the edges? Who's fully plugged in and who stays on the fringe? These are not technical decisions, they are political ones. And in a world where defense technology is so expensive no single country can replicate it alone, such dependency becomes almost inescapable. Within that picture, a seemingly remote land begins to come into sharp focus. A vast, icy, sparsely populated mass at the edge of the world, yet positioned at the heart of every strategic trajectory. Greenland. If Golden Dome is the shield, then Greenland is one of its key pillars. Not because the US lacks a presence there. They already have bases, radars, and a long military history on the island. The issue is not whether they're there, but how much control they have, and what political binding comes with it. In nuclear warfare, a few minutes of early warning can decide the fate of an entire continent. Greenland provides those precious minutes. And that's why it is never just a military story. It's a story of sovereignty, of who has the final say in the emerging Arctic security architecture. Golden Dome, in the end, doesn't stop at the sky. It pulls the world's gaze down to the frozen ground of the north, where geography has never been neutral. And from that moment on, North American security is no longer just about missiles and radars. It's about Greenland, the Arctic, and the way power is now being anchored to places that seem cold and distant, but have never been meaningless. There are places that don't need large populations, wealth, or noise to become strategically dangerous. Greenland is one of them. A vast, icy expanse with sparse inhabitants, seemingly removed from the world's modern power struggles. But it's precisely that silence that has made it one of the most geopolitically pivotal locations of the 21st century. On the military map, Greenland is not on the periphery. It sits directly beneath the shortest intercontinental missile flight paths between nuclear superpowers. In the worst-case scenarios, every flight path from Russia to North America sweeps across the Arctic, and Greenland is where the first signals can be detected. A few extra minutes of warning in nuclear warfare isn't a technical detail. It's the line between reaction and paralysis, between survival and collapse. The US understood this early on. They've maintained bases, radars, and a long-standing military presence. But in the new strategic logic now taking shape, presence alone is no longer enough. The ambition is no longer just to be there, but to shape the entire Arctic theater with as few constraints as possible. And this is where the story leaves the realm of military logistics and steps into its most sensitive terrain: sovereignty. An autonomous Greenland, tied to Denmark and operating within NATO's structure, means every major strategic decision must pass through layers of complex negotiation. A Greenland with deeper dependence on Washington tells a very different story. When actual control starts to outpace legal boundaries, the Arctic stops being a shared space among allies and begins to look like a direct extension of a US-led security architecture. That's why any public statement about Greenland's right to self-determination carries weight far beyond democratic principle. When Canada publicly emphasized that Greenland's future must be decided by Greenlanders and Denmark, they weren't just affirming democratic values. They were, knowingly or not, brushing up against the limits of a larger strategic vision, one in which the Arctic is seen as the next frontier of global power competition. The response didn't come in the form of blunt declarations. It came through economic signals, commercial pressure, and public reminders of dependence. In this light, the Arctic is no longer a zone of cooperation, but a testing ground for allied loyalty. Those who align with a centralized vision of power will be protected. Those who emphasize sovereignty and balance will have to learn to live with pressure. What makes the situation even more complex is that the Arctic doesn't belong solely to the US and its allies. Russia is aggressively militarizing the region. China, with no Arctic territory of its own, now calls itself a near-Arctic power, pushing in through science, investment, and trade. In this landscape, Greenland and the entire Arctic Rim has become a zone where every major power wants to leave a mark, and no one is willing to stay on the sidelines. For Canada, this is the hardest strategic dilemma in decades. They are an Arctic nation. They share the space, the history of defense, and the early warning infrastructure with the US. But they also know, if the Arctic is redefined as Washington's strategic backyard, Ottawa's role could be dangerously diminished. From partner to buffer zone. That fear isn't a distant hypothetical. It's present in every discussion about radar systems, new shipping routes as the ice melts, resource extraction, and Most crucially, who has the final say when security decisions are made in the far north? Greenland in this story isn't just a spot on the map. It's a mirror, reflecting how the Western order is changing. And when that mirror comes into full view, Canada is forced to look inward. Caught between a traditional security umbrella that is increasingly conditional and the desire to preserve strategic sovereignty in a multipolar world, Ottawa realizes it is standing between two difficult choices. The Arctic no longer allows for ambiguity, and from those seemingly motionless blocks of ice, Canada's path forward is being forced to split into ever clearer directions, each carrying a price that cannot be ignored. Canada now stands in a position that history rarely allows anyone to occupy for long. Not on the front lines of a war, but no longer safe in the rear either. A liminal space where every decision carries strategic consequences that could stretch across decades. And what makes this position so suffocating isn't open hostility, but a growing ambiguity in its relationship with its closest ally. Geographically, Canada has no escape route. It shares the world's longest border with the United States. Its defense space, supply chains, export markets, and early warning systems are all tightly interwoven with Washington. For decades, that wasn't a problem. It was the foundation of stability. But now that security is being redefined as a transaction, that deep integration has become a vulnerability. Canada isn't sitting on the sidelines. It has ramped up defense spending to levels unseen in years. It's investing tens of billions of dollars in military infrastructure in the Arctic and in force modernization. It has expanded its role in NATO, deepened cooperation with Nordic and Baltic countries, and stepped up participation in regional security frameworks. Ottawa isn't shirking responsibility, but it also refuses to accept the logic that such contributions must be exchanged for strategic silence. The problem is, in the emerging world, neutrality is no longer a viable option. Canada cannot turn its back on the US, but neither can it accept being seen as a country that merely lives off American protection. Each public reminder from Washington, each dismissive comment about Canada's historical role, chips away at the psychological foundation of the relationship. And once trust begins to erode, even security guarantees, whether written into treaties or embedded in technology, begin to feel fragile. Into that vacuum, China has entered, not as a security ally, but as an economic alternative. Markets, investments, trade, tools that Ottawa can use to reduce its total dependence on the US. But every step in that direction is met with suspicion from Washington. No bold declarations are needed, just warnings about strategic mistakes or implied risks, enough to force Canada into a constant state of political defense. Tightrope walking is the most accurate image for Canada's current state. On one side lies traditional security, familiar but increasingly conditional. On the other, the effort to expand its strategic autonomy, full of risk, mistrust, and potential retaliation. Every move toward one side is interpreted as distance from the other. And in that precarious balancing act, Ottawa knows that no path forward is truly safe. What worries Canada isn't a sudden shock, it's the slow slide. The day may come when they are still protected, but no longer consulted, still shielded, but no longer regarded as an equal partner. In that future, sovereignty wouldn't disappear in a dramatic decision, but would be worn down through a series of small compromises. And so the biggest question Canada now faces isn't whom to choose, but how much self-determination it can retain in a shifting global order. Caught between a security umbrella that comes with growing strings attached and a multipolar world filled with uncertainty, Ottawa is trying to move forward without losing itself. But in an era where security has a price tag and alliances are tested through obedience, that path has never been narrower. Some systems don't collapse in a sudden explosion. They unravel when the way people talk about them begins to shift. The Western Alliance is entering such a moment. Not because it lacks enemies, but because the values that once held its members together are quietly being replaced by a different logic, the logic of transaction. In that logic, security is no longer a moral or historical commitment. It becomes a service. Protection has a price. Participation is measured. And the sacrifices of the past, if they no longer serve the politics of the present, can be shelved like an outdated chapter. What's alarming isn't that the world is changing. That's inevitable. It's that the change is happening at the very core of what was once considered the most stable system in global politics. Canada's story isn't a diplomatic mishap. It's a test to see how far a close, long-standing ally can be pushed publicly before the system breaks. And the world's reaction reveals this. Many nations are quietly taking notes, not in statements, but in strategic calculations. Europe saw the narrative of Afghanistan rewritten. They saw Article 5 reframed through a lens of convenience. Japan and South Korea heard the calls for gratitude and wondered what that would mean for their own future scenarios. Countries outside the core alliance drew an even colder conclusion. If even the closest allies can be treated this way, then how much is trust in this order really worth? In the age of transaction, power lies not only in weapons or technology, but in the ability to decide who gets protected and who doesn't. Golden Dome, the Board of Peace, the Arctic, Greenland, these are not isolated developments. They are pieces of a larger puzzle in which power is being restructured around control of security infrastructure. And when that infrastructure is held by a single center, alliances cease to be mutual bonds. They become asymmetric relationships. The irony is that this very model, the transactional model, may undermine the very thing it seeks to protect. Trust cannot be bought forever. It is built over time, through shared memories, through crises overcome together. When that memory is eroded, nations begin looking for backup plans, not to betray, but to survive in a system growing more unpredictable by the day. Canada in this story is neither a victim nor a rebel. It is the image of an ally forced to stay alert in a world where loyalty is no longer assumed. And that alertness poses a larger question to the entire Western order. Can an alliance truly endure if it's managed like a short-term contract? Perhaps the most important question isn't whether the US will stay on this path. It's how the rest of the world will respond. Will nations accept a future in which security goes to the highest bidder, or will they try to redefine cooperation, even if that path is uncertain and fraught with risk? History shows us that security systems rarely fall to outside threats. They unravel when those inside stop believing in one another. And in this moment, when alliances are tested through obedience rather than trust, the world stands at a quiet but decisive crossroads. If you have your own thoughts on whether the Western security order is truly entering a transactional era, or if this is simply a turbulent transition, leave your perspective in the comments. Your voice might surface questions we haven't yet thought to ask. And if you'd like to follow more in-depth analysis on the geopolitical shifts shaping our world, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next.